Now start with the third technical session for the day, Climate and Climate Events, Impacts and Cost. The speakers will have 25 minutes of presentation, followed by 5 minutes of question and answers. A bell will be rang at the 20-minute mark, indicating a remainder of 5 minutes. And after the presentation time is over, the bell will be rang again. Please keep note of the time. The session moderators for this session are Professor Andy Shin from INVE Aquaculture Thailand. The virtual moderator is Anton Emik from Think Aqua UK, and the Thai moderator is Dr. Rachakon Wangwaradechkul, again from INVE Aquaculture Thailand.
Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you all here once again. I hope you're all fresh and ready for the next technical session. I hope you just enjoyed the milkfish demonstration and had an opportunity to taste some of the products. Tomorrow there's going to be another demonstration, so please be sure not to miss that. That again will start at 10 and will run for an hour. Okay, I think we should dive straight into the first speaker in today's session, and it gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. Rohana Subasinghe, who's the director of FUTUREFISH. He's based in the UK. And this morning, Rohana's going to be talking about climate change and cage aquaculture. Is it a real concern? So Rohana, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Okay. Good morning. I'm have 25 minutes or 20 minutes, right? So I'll try to even finish before, right? So give a bit more chance to interact. You can see from the title that I put a question mark at the end, a real concern. So I don't have an answer. The answer is with you, right? So let's see how we move. Right. Before that, there are 3 names. I put Andy's name without asking him. And Salim, of course, I asked Salim, can I have your name? And the reason is that we published a book last year. I edited the 3rd edition of the cage culture book with Patrick Wu. In that book, me, Andy, and Salim, we wrote 3 chapters. All 3 chapters are basically on climate change, cage aquaculture, disease control, biosecurity, sort of various aspects. So to do that, we did quite a bit of research. And we thought probably it's a time to talk about a little bit of that research, what we found. I'm not going to talk about biosecurity or health at all in these 20 minutes. I'm just going to tell you what we found when we were working on climate change and cage culture. Cage culture, of course, is a way of innovation for open water aquaculture, we all know, sort of. And the cage culture, we think, probably began, in somewhere in the Mekong Delta years ago, right? And so still is being practiced in Mekong Delta. So research shows that it is 1800, sort of way back, sort of this particular system. The cage aquaculture has greatly expanded and intensified during the past decades. And it is now gone beyond Asia into various parts of the world, and of course Europe and everywhere. The currently undergoing very strong development, fast development, because we are using very high value species in cage aquaculture. And the challenges they're driven by the globalization and the requirement for food and bigger production. Cage aquaculture is now established successfully in various environments. You have cage aquaculture in, of course, marine, brackish water, freshwater, almost everywhere. Due to the scarcity of suitable sites, particularly land sites, so when we move into water, the cage aquaculture expanded into previously unexplored open waters in many parts of the world, right? And freshwaters, lakes, rivers, and then coastal brackish waters, estuaries, bays, sort of, wherever you can find some water, there you can place something floating, of course, then there is cage culture. There has been a drive to cluster existing cages in many places to see because whether you can manage as a cluster rather than managing a system as an individual unit. Farming fish in cages has a lot of advantages compared to farming in ponds. Of course, cage-based systems have a very low operational cost because you have a, I don't need to tell you, are you all very much aware of that? And then again, no energy is required for sort of water exchange, so it is natural water exchange. But at the same time, it also has certain challenges and certain sort of problems with respect to using natural waters, and again without having necessary to use energy, the carbon footprint of cage aquaculture seems to be much lower compared to some other competitive systems. Cage aquaculture is widely practiced in many parts of the world, and FAO says more than 70 countries in the world practice cage aquaculture. And almost all marine finfish aquaculture is in cages. Marine, right? Not brackish water, marine finfish. Many species of freshwater fish also cultured in cages in Asia mainly, and also in Latin America to some extent, and of course, cage culture is suitable for wide range of open, fresh, brackish, and marine ecosystems. Cage aquaculture of tilapia is also visible in many freshwater reservoirs in Africa. And mainly in Africa, large reservoirs, large lakes, you can see tilapia is farmed in cages. In many countries, especially in Southeast Asia, cage aquaculture follows simple technology. And probably cage culture started with a very simple bamboo or sort of a very low technology. And construction using local ingredients and local material, and prevailing economic conditions, you can probably make. People think that cage culture is expensive. You need a big capital investment for a cage, but depends on what you want to, where you want to do it, and what you want to farm. You can make cages cheaper, or you can make cages very expensive. Marine fish farming on an industrial scale has been recently, have a very recent history because it started very recently. It has expanded to many countries, currently contributing to an annual production of more than 7 million tons, most of which comes from sea cages, and this has been increasing. From very simple cages in 1960s to very sophisticated cages that you find these days, or different varieties of cages. Marine finfish aquaculture entails more advanced technologies and profitable production using high-value fish. Species-wise, there are a list of species that cage aquaculture uses. Historically, mainly salmonids, but then again, you have all different, whole list of animals that you use in cage aquaculture. However, over the past decades, past years, you can see other species also coming into cage aquaculture. Omnivorous species also being farmed in cage aquaculture, carps, right? And not only marine, and then of course in freshwaters and other environments. The type of structures, I remember this 4 categories of, 4 types of, came from probably World Fish publication. Fixed cages, floating cages, submerged cages, and submersible cages. The fixed cages, of course, is basically you have nets fixed into the to the bottom. Then you have floating cages with the cages floats, and submerged cages you can see them. Submersible is you can even put them completely underwater. The shape, size, the design of cages dedicated based on the requirement, the condition of water, and also the species that you would like to farm. And of course the hydrology, because the buoyancy and various other aspects are important with respect to putting a cage together. The surface-based floating cages are the most common, dominated. They're floating cages. And of course, they are often more prone to suboptimal water qualities, conditions, and cage damage due to natural calamities, and they always have issues. After 2007 FAO publication on cage aquaculture, there's no good review of the cage aquaculture done for past 15 years. And production-wise, what was given in 2007 FAO review, after that, there's no focused assessment of the cage aquaculture contribution to the global aquaculture production. Idea is to talk about climate change impacts of aquaculture. The impacts of climate change on aquaculture have been studied. Many studies have demonstrated the harmful impacts of abrupt climate changes. The word climate change is something that we need to look at carefully. What exactly you mean by climate change? We all talk about climate change. A lot of rain these days, a lot of droughts. Is that the climate change? Right? Climate change is a very, very big 2 words. You can put many things under climate change. And then you try to link it to many things. And today we are talking about climate change and aquaculture. And in aquaculture, we talk about climate change and cage culture, right? Let's see what we found and let's see where we are. The Global Climate Risk Index, what we call CRI, uses several extreme weather events parameters to rank countries according to their exposure and vulnerability and their capacity to cope with this climate change. So this CRI is an index, right, that we use to look at the climate change. So using the average CRI scores for the period of 2000 to 2019, they came up with 10 countries with the highest CRI index. Those countries are Myanmar, Haiti, the Philippines, Mozambique, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Thailand, Nepal, Madagascar, and Vietnam. Does it mean that aquaculture in cage culture is could be a problem in these countries. This is climate risk index. We don't know. However, the CRI scores are not a comprehensive score of climate vulnerability and should not be used in isolation as a predictor of future climatic impacts. In fact, there is nothing really as an index that you can predict what the climate would be in sort of a futuristic climatic conditions. Nevertheless, CRI could be a warning signal for the countries who are producing fish, not necessarily only cage culture, but in aquaculture where water can be climate change. These countries, there could be impacts in the water systems in these countries. Another area of climate change that we're talking about is the greenhouse gas emission. In general, greenhouse gas emission of aquaculture comparatively low compared to many other livestock species. And of course, there are even negative greenhouse gas emission species. It has been estimated that 245 metric tons of carbon dioxide, equivalent to approximately 0.49 of that year's total global atmospheric GHG emission, originated from aquaculture. So you can just imagine 0.49% of the global greenhouse gas emission is from aquaculture. Still some groups talking about greenhouse gas emission in aquaculture. Nevertheless, of course, there are differences in different categories and different systems and different species in aquaculture. Right. So greenhouse gas emission associated with the global trade of aquaculture, it is something that we need to look at, but we only talk about production. But it is not the fish that you produce, we eaten in the local market, but they go all over the world. And I remember we're talking about air miles and sort of fish miles and shrimp miles and sort of. So I think the post-harvest part of the aquaculture value chain also has probably more greenhouse gas emission and in aquaculture. The major elements of climatic change presents as threatening aquaculture production and sustainability includes. I put the word threatening because that's the word we found in the literature. So always say it threatens aquaculture. Right? We were not convinced whether everything really threatens aquaculture. Rising temperature. Of course, rising temperature is a phenomenon, right? And we've seen the impacts of rising temperature in fisheries. We've seen migration of stocks up north with the rising temperatures in the south. So if you look at this graph, you can see very clearly there is a rising temperature globally. What is the impact of this rising temperature in aquaculture? And what's the impact of this rising temperature in cage culture, in salmon culture, in marine, in freshwater? We always say rising temperature is a problem. But we really couldn't find a real evidence to show that rising temperature has a problem in aquaculture. You can see this monthly sea surface temperature. It is changing. Maybe we will have a problem in 100 years' time or 50 years' time. Do we really have a problem? I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I'm just throwing the spanner at you. That's why I started with a question mark. We could not find strong evidence in the research showing the increase in temperature has a major impact in aquaculture production. The second, of course, ocean acidification. We talk a lot about ocean acidification. Definitely it is an issue, right? Is it a problem for aquaculture? A mariculture, you can see from here. The pH is coming down, but very, very little, right? If you continue for another 100 years, probably it will be different. But is it an issue with aquaculture? I don't know. Then we talk about disease. Here we go. Maybe we can ask Andy, how much did you think? Yes, there are possibilities because so many papers, so many publications linking disease outbreaks to changes in temperature, changes in salinity, changes in various indices, right? But not necessarily with fish growth or sort of FCR or anything. But there was a disease, yes, the pathogens, because the animals get stressed, so therefore animals become. And then you have harmful algal blooms, and you have changes in rainfall. And this farm is in Nigeria, biggest tilapia producer, 260 cages. There was a downfall of rain, 400 millimeters over 24 hours. They lost 200 tons of fish overnight. Is that downfall is a climate change? I don't know. But why? The dissolved oxygen levels went down to almost zero, right? Is it a climate change issue? I don't know. Then we have sea level rising. You can see that, right? Impact on aquaculture, again, for me as question mark. Uncertainty about external input supplies. We are talking about fish meal supplies and various climatic conditions, sort of governing the anchovietas in Latin America and sort of various things we talk about. Changes in surface acid salinity and severe climatic events like sort of they are all sort of. So not all these factors need to affect aquaculture production in the same way, but they can be sort of considered on independently. It can also impact. Again, our literature search was not very convincing that there was a major issue. Right. Mitigation and adaptation. Climatic change adaptations is a broad term, and everybody says we need adaptation for climate change. It requires sort of climate change, while it's a very complex issue. Adaptation to climate change can be complicated process that presents numerous problems, more so when completing demands for more similar resource frequently results user conflicts. Several studies have looked at potential techniques for aquaculture and fisheries adaptation to climate change, with the emphasis on production and predictably lower profitability and economic issues. Only a few studies have focused specifically on the impact of climate change on cage farming, but once again, there was not much impacts was described in that publication. There is a paucity of information on specific adaptations and mitigations, strategies tackling climate change impacts in aquaculture, let alone cage culture. No extensive assessments relating to climate-associated risks in cage farming is available at the moment. There are many research and information gaps, and more global research is recommended on this particular subject, rather than sort of pointing out, saying that there is an issue with climate change and aquaculture or cage culture. More research on species for their tolerance to environmental stresses, such stresses such as extreme temperatures, salinity, dissolved oxygen is required to be identified, new species or strains which better resilience to these changes. Studies on effects of climate change on molecular level, alterations of fish is required. In fact, we have not seen anything, right? And I think we are all into molecular level research, but climate change and molecular level changes is still to be investigated. Thank you. I struggle a little bit because the fonts were very small on the screen. Anyway.
Thank you very much, Rohana. Do we have any questions? There were some wonderful points made there in that presentation. Do we have a question for Rohana? I think Karen was first. Sorry.
It's closer to the mic. Yeah. Actually, just a comment. What I see as a big problem in cage aquaculture, especially in Africa, is that people want to share the walkways between their cages, so they end up clustering their cages close together, so you have 200 cages side by side by side. A good percentage have 0 sides open to the water, and that's just asking for trouble. And they keep doing it. They have a disease outbreak, they throw the dead fish down the river or in the lake, and that affects the other farmers. So there's a lot of practices in cage aquaculture now that could be improved, whether we have climate change or not. The other problem is the overloading of the water. You know, typically you should really not go beyond 2 to 8 kilos of feed per hectare per day of feed input in the water body, depending on the hydraulic retention time, and no one pays attention to that until they have one of these big die-offs. So there's a really big need for zoning and proper regulation and education of the cage owners.
Yes, fully agree. I think general management, zoning management of systems is not necessarily because of climate change. I think the cage culture, it has its own problems, as you said very clearly, yes. But this particular case that I showed you, they're the only company in that lake. It was not very small, it's fairly large, but they were fairly, sort of distance. But unfortunately, the DO levels went down to almost 0, and they died overnight. But what they said is that they have not experienced this level of downfall, a volume of water coming down, 400 millimeters of rain in 24 hours. So that could be the climate change.
We also have a large virtual community who's following the talk as well, and I believe we have a question coming in as well.
Yeah, so this question from online, there are a couple of questions actually, Rohana, around whether cage aquaculture is more or less susceptible than maybe pond systems, and another one, maybe similar, about whether we should be more concerned or less concerned about climate risks than, or should we carry on business as usual?
Yeah. Good question. I think a cage culture system, you have very low control over water. It's basically, but if you're talking about, it's not contained. So therefore, whatever happens in the water, this morning, we talked to someone from Singapore. The Johor Strait, the DO level at that point, he had an app on his hand, 1.5 DO level in the Johor Strait. 9 o'clock this morning, right? So you have no control unless You put your paddle wheels or oxygen or whatever it is if you want to do cage culture. A pond culture or contained aquaculture has more control over water and more control on biosecurity. But again, if you're talking about, sort of open cage culture, you to go to Indonesia and, sort of Lake Toba, many places, sort of you can get into trouble with pathogens and therefore, you have less control. And regarding climate change, although we are not fully convinced with the information we have in hand, but I think we should be vigilant at least, sort of we should keep thinking. And we do many things which will help not to escalate the problem in the years to come, rather than acting now that we have an issue. Definitely there will be an issue if you're not responsible in what we do.
I know we had a lot of questions. I'm just going to take one last quick question, if I may, from Professor Shvan.
Sir, thank you so much. Very informative presentations. But my concern is, as cage aquaculture is totally depends on the artificial feed. There is no as such natural food is available. Even it is available, but due to the very intensive type of culture systems, very high stocking density we use. So whether it is a thumb rule again, after putting the 1 kg of feed, almost 25% to 30% which will be accumulated at the bottom in the form of uneaten feed and as well as the fecal matter. So what about the sustainability in next 25 years or 50 years, such type of aquaculture systems? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, depends again, sort of scale, right? There are cage systems where you have minimal wastage of feed now, but they are sophisticated. You cannot have carps sitting in a cage like that. You have to have a very sort of a high price commodity inside that cage. Then only you can make a profit. But depends on the size of what you do, your scale, your species that you, and each system has its own advantages and its disadvantages. But I think it is important for you to, in the years to come, I'm pretty sure, even as sort of a low technology, cage systems will evolve further to make it more and more sustainable in practice and less problematic.
Thank you very much, Rohana. I know we have many more questions for Rohana, but perhaps we can take those into the coffee breaks and the lunchtime. But could we thank Rohana once again? Thank you. We're now going to move on to our next speaker, and this comes from Professor Ben Belton. Ben is from Michigan State University. You may be aware that we've seen some recent events unfolding in Bangladesh. Ben is based in Bangladesh, but he's prepared a presentation for us, so we're going to play the video. So first of all, good morning, Ben. Thank you very much for preparing the presentation for us. And Ben's talk is on inland aquaculture, under climate change,
Good morning,
a
everyone.
global review of emerging impacts and adaptations. So I think we're going to pass over and we're going to play Ben's presentation. So thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I wish I was there with you all in Bangkok. Good morning, everyone. I wish I was there with
Just trying to
you
fix
all
the
in
sound.
Bangkok, but unfortunately I'm not. So recorded version of this presentation on emerging evidence of climate change impacts and adaptations in inland aquatic food systems. So this is some work that myself, my colleague Abby Bennett and others at Michigan State University have been working on for the past year or so. And I'm going to be focusing today particularly on climate change impacts and adaptations in inland aquaculture in countries in the global south. So the outline for today is we're going to talk a little bit about the knowledge gaps that motivate the research, then the methodology that we followed, then a sort of conceptual framework that we've developed for understanding the impacts of climate change in aquatic food systems. And then I'm going to talk specifically about some of the early results from our literature review and then from key informant interviews that we've been conducting as part of the project, and provide some preliminary conclusions. First of all, the motivation for this piece of research was based on what we identified as being some important knowledge gaps around climate change and aquatic food systems. So we believe that the implications of climate change for aquatic food systems are poorly understood relative to terrestrial food systems, so crop agriculture. Many of the studies that exist already are high-level projections, so they're based on models about what may be happening at national scale, for instance, or global scale. And we observe that there's relatively few empirical studies of how climate change is playing out through localized impacts and adaptations. We also note that many of the projections of climate impacts are in aquatic food systems are focused on marine and or coastal environments, so lack of attention to inland. And then finally, there's little attention to the relationship between climate change and other processes that mediate the impacts of climate change in aquatic food systems. And so this is something that we'll expand on later in the presentation as being particularly important. So in terms of a methodology, there's two parts. We conducted a systematic literature review. So first of all, we had a series of search terms around inland aquaculture, inland fisheries, and climate change. We searched Scopus, Web of Science, returned more than 3,000 articles. After removing duplicates and non-peer-reviewed articles, we had more than 1,600. And then we went through those manually as a team with a group of students, excluding articles that were not relevant because they didn't have enough focus on climate change, for instance. They were too technical. They weren't specifically focused on aquaculture and fisheries and so on. That left us with 425 articles that were in scope. And then we went through a process of manually tagging each of those with a series of tags relating to the themes that they were about. And that returned 114 papers that dealt with inland aquaculture, of which 68 dealing with inland aquaculture in the global south. And it's those papers that I'm going to be talking about in today's presentation. Then the second part of our research was a series of key informant interviews. So these are in-depth, semi-structured interviews, mainly conducted online, and with key informants purposefully selected for their deep understanding and knowledge of fisheries and aquaculture in specific countries. And we've covered 22 countries and counting at the present, with possibly some additional ones to be added. And I'm going to summarize a few examples of case studies from those interviews in the second half of this presentation. So, as part of this process of developing the literature review, we developed the conceptual framework that you can see here to help us analyze the content of the literature and the key informant interviews. So we see it being comprised of 4 basic components. The first is climate hazards. So these are things like changing temperatures, changes in precipitation, floods, droughts, changes in river flow, the result of changes in the climate. And these have impacts on aquatic food systems. So They may drive changes in species abundance, changes in spawning success, changes in habitat, in the distribution of species, in incomes, in saltwater intrusion, many different possible impacts. And then the actors in these food systems, farmers, fishers, may adapt to the impacts. So by modifying fisheries management, by modifying aquaculture management practices, through government support, through income diversification, through migration, there's many different adaptations, but all of those impacts of climate hazards and the adaptations to them are mediated by a whole series of what we call conditioning factors. So this is the green box. So we have environmental conditioning factors, the types of species being produced or that are present in an ecosystem, the level of degradation of a habitat, the level of fishing pressure, the amount of pollution, for instance, the social issues of governance, policy, economic status of different groups, gender, and then economic factors, levels of urbanization, trade, prices, technological change, and so on. All of these factors condition the form of the impacts of climate hazards and the ways in which people are able to adapt to them. And then for the larger analysis of aquatic food systems, we have these three additional sort of analytical categories. So the first is development. We look at cases from global north and global south. So we have reason to believe that these could be systemically different, both because of the level of economic development in these different regions, but also because of the types of species, the types of production systems. Then we look at the type of fisheries, so capture fisheries, aquaculture, recreational fisheries, which are also part of the broader analysis. And then the type of water body, so fluvial, that's rivers and streams, lacustrine, that's lakes and ponds, and paludal, that's wetlands. So you can imagine that the types of impacts might vary across these different kinds of aquatic environments. So that's our total conceptual framework, but we're going to be focusing today particularly on the sections that are relevant to inland aquaculture in the global south. So just to give you a quick overview of the studies, this graph here is showing the percentage of articles tagged with inland aquaculture in global south by country. So you see immediately there's not a huge number of countries there, so only 11 countries with more than one study. And it's a heavily skewed distribution. 22% of those articles deal with Bangladesh, 18% deal with India, 16% deal with Vietnam. Thailand is number 4 with 7% of articles. China, which accounts for almost 2/3 of the world's aquaculture production, almost only has 4% of articles. So you can see very unrepresentative coverage of global aquaculture in these studies, little from China, Indonesia, most of Africa with the exception of Nigeria, and so on. Then in terms of major hazards, these are the most common ones presented here. More than half of articles mention floods. Then we have temperature, specifically water temperature, climatic variability, such as changes in precipitation or seasonality, sea level rise or saline intrusion being another common one, and then extreme events like cyclones and storms, all being some of the most common hazards. And just to illustrate this, actually part of the reason I became interested in this topic was because a couple of years ago, back in 2022, I was involved in this project in Assam in India, where we were establishing breeding of small indigenous fish species in a hatchery. And part of the reason that we selected this hatchery is that it had not flooded ever before. And then within a couple of months of establishing the hatchery, there was a devastating flood and as you can see, the entire area completely underwater, and so that sort of really drew my attention to the fact that these impacts are already occurring in the real world. So then, okay, what impacts are those hazards having? Some of the most common ones noted in the literature are loss of income or food security. That perhaps reflects a focus in the literature on small-scale aquaculture, especially if you think a lot of the papers are from Bangladesh, from India. Lower productivity, kind of an obvious one. Physical damage to farms, incidence of disease. These are all some of the major things that come out in the literature review. Then if we turn to adaptations to these climate impacts, the key thing here really is that so we listed different types of concrete adaptations. We tagged those, but we also included a tag for whether the adaptations were hypothetical or proposed, or whether they were observed or actual adaptations. And so in this already quite small pool of literature, 59% of the adaptations are hypothetical adaptations versus 37% that are observed, basically real adaptations that have already happened. So in some, there's relatively little evidence of how people are actually adapting to the impacts of climate change in aquaculture in the literature at present. But you can see some of the adaptive strategies include support from government, sharing information, modifying management techniques, modifying infrastructure, diversifying income, and so on. Then moving on to the factors that condition the ability to adapt or the way that impacts are experienced. You can see there are many different conditioning factors. There are actually many more than presented in this single graph. And these fall into environmental, so pollution is the most common, mentioned in 21% of articles, but the presence of dams also has a big impact. Invasive species, processes like siltation. You see also economic conditioning factors, the prices of inputs, of outputs, urbanization, technological change, and then social and political factors like policy and governance. All of these condition the responses that farms have to the impacts of these hazards. Okay, so to summarize briefly, there's been surprisingly little attention to the impacts of climate change and adaptations to those impacts in inland aquaculture in the Global South to date. The geographical coverage to date has been very skewed. It's not representative. We see that hypothetical adaptations are more commonly reported than actual real observed adaptations. And we see also that there are numerous different environmental, economic, and social factors that condition the impacts of climate hazards and the adaptation to those impacts. So in short, much more empirical work is needed. There's a lot that we don't know. We need to find out more. And so the themes that came out of this literature review, the gaps that we identified, and the conceptual framework that we developed helped us to think about the way that we would structure our in-depth interviews with key informants. And those are what I'm going to present in the second half of this presentation here. 4 case studies drawn from those interviews, plus 1 case study drawn from recent field work, which we will present in the second half of this presentation. Okay, so case study number 1 is from Bangladesh. And what you see in this picture here is a seasonal pond in northwest Bangladesh. This is by part of somebody's homestead, and it's used for polyculture of carps. So these ponds are rain-fed, and the key hazard that they've experienced is that within the past 15 years, the onset of the monsoon rains has become later. It's shifted from April to June or July, and that's impacted the grow-out period by reducing it by 2 or 3 months. So there's now only 5 to 6 months in a year where there's sufficient water in which to grow fish in these seasonal ponds. The adaptation that farmers have made to cope with that is that they've shifted from stocking fingerlings that are 2 to 3 inches in size to large overwintered fingerlings, which are 6 to 8 inches in length. And when they're stocked, they grow very quickly and they can reach marketable size within 4 to 5 months. So this is being conditioned by dynamic input supply chains. So we've had nurseries in these areas that have adapted, have innovated. The farmers themselves have adapted by starting to stock these larger fingerlings. This has been supported by extension messages promoted by government and NGOs. And also, at the same time, we have ongoing intensification of these pond systems through increasing use of pelleted feed. And so now we have yields that are actually higher despite the shorter growing season, because farms have adopted this combination of larger fingerlings and more feed. So you can say, as an outcome, this is really quite a successful example of indigenous adaptation, at least to date. Okay, our second case study comes from China, and this is a picture of a mitten crab pond, and the key hazard that I'm going to focus here on is higher summer temperatures. So higher and prolonged periods of higher temperatures in summer can create direct mortality for mitten crabs or other species stocked in these ponds. They also reduce dissolved oxygen. They can cause stress that leads to disease outbreaks, and this is especially common in shallow ponds such as those used to grow mitten crabs, crawfish, and so on. So adaptations to address those impacts include deepening ponds, using less feeds during periods of hot weather, using aeration, using aquatic plants to provide shelter, shade, and so on. The ability of farmers to make these adaptations is actually not severely conditioned by access to financial resources. So even smaller farmers with these kind of systems are essentially SMEs, so they have sufficient resources to modify their ponds by deepening them, say, or by adding aeration. The government extension services are providing advice to help farmers to make these changes, and there's good access to infrastructure such as electricity and roads, which allows farmers access to the inputs they need, the ability to install aerators and so on. So in sum, the higher temperatures have been manageable so far through these adaptations, and there are even some benefits of higher temperatures. So for instance, the range of certain species has increased. So as the northern part of the country warms, then some species can be grown there that couldn't previously be farmed. And also there are fewer mass mortality events during the winter due to less frequent extreme low temperature events. So even some positive effects there. We have a somewhat different scenario in Mexico, where our case study focuses on large-scale tilapia culture in reservoirs. So here the key climate hazards are a shortening of the rainy season, but with more intense rainfall during that period, and also more extremes of both high and low temperature, and then water shortages at some points in the year. So the impacts of this is that oftentimes before there are heavy rain events, there is a drawdown of dams to prevent flooding. So the dams release large amounts of water quickly because they want to avoid overflowing when there's heavy rain. and so the water levels in the reservoirs fluctuate. At other times, the water levels can be very low due to low amounts of rainfall. And as the water fluctuates, the water level fluctuates, we get mixing of the water column. Organic waste that accumulates below cages can become suspended in the water column. That can reduce dissolved oxygen, stress the fish, trigger disease outbreaks, and in some cases create mass mortalities. Actually, the cages, the large cage farms in these reservoirs find it very difficult to adapt in situ to these situations, in part because the cages are fixed in place. The location of the concessions for the cages is fixed also. So one of really the only adaptations is to shift these farms into new reservoirs that haven't been farmed before. So there are some conditioners of these impacts and adaptations. One is poor farm management practices. So overfeeding can create buildup of this organic matter below cages. But another critical one is the governance of the reservoirs themselves. So there's a lack of coordination between the agencies responsible for managing the dams and the agency responsible for managing aquaculture. And the farms are not considered and are not informed when the decision is taken to release water from these reservoirs. So there's no way that they can prepare for these events. And as an outcome, quite shockingly, actually, Mexico's production or estimated production of farmed tilapia fell by about 1/3 in just 3 years from 2020 to 2023. However, more positively, smaller pond and tank-based systems, while these are also facing some climate challenges such as water shortages, the impacts of hurricanes, are proving to be a lot more resilient than these larger cage-based systems. Our fourth case study comes from Egypt, as you can see illustrated here. And here we're talking about pond-based tilapia culture. So here the key hazards are higher water temperatures, water scarcity, and rising levels of salinity. Sort of together these result in declining water quality. So there's sort of higher concentrations of pollutants as there is less water available. That combined with higher temperatures is creating stress, leading to a higher incidence of disease on farms. And so there's been a yield decrease of about 5 to 10% due to what's known as summer mortality on farms on average. Also, this has been impacting hatcheries. So there's been about a 20% reduction in the average productivity, the number of fingerlings produced in tilapia hatcheries in Egypt over the past few years. That's also attributable to these poor water quality and higher temperatures. So what adaptations are there? One is to alter stocking density. So the advice is to reduce stocking density when temperature is higher. Actually, some farms do the opposite and try to stock more to compensate, leading to negative outcomes. Also reducing feeding. And again, we see in this case overwintering of fingerlings becoming popular. So fingerlings are being stocked in October, held over winter, and then that allows there to be a crop that can be harvested before the hottest weather. And then it's possible even to stock possibly a second crop after the hot weather. So actually intensification helping to avoid these issues. And in the most extreme cases, in a few locations, there's been a shift from production of tilapia to production of marine species like sea bass and sea bream in ponds in places where the salinity levels have got very high. So all of this is conditioned by access to financial resources and technical knowledge. Larger farms tend to be better able to adapt. They tend to hire technical staff. They also receive technical support offered by feed companies. That's not always available to smaller farms. And then the government policy on the allocation of water to agriculture is also very important for determining access to water. So as a set of outcomes, climate stress is evident in these systems, but so far it's been relatively manageable by improving or modifying management practices, especially in the case of these larger farms. Okay, so our fifth and final case study comes from Thailand. And I thought this would be appropriate given the location of the conference. This is not actually based on key informant interviews. This is based on some ongoing field work. And you can see here, this is a photograph taken in Samut Prakan. You can see where the boundaries of a pond have been eroded away by the sea, and possibly in the far distance, you can even see some telegraph poles far out at sea in an area that used to be covered by land. So this is an area on the coast where there's a traditional system of extensive shrimp polyculture that's been practiced for over 100 years. The key hazards here related to the climate are that the coastline has receded by between 1 and 5 kilometers, depending on the location, within the past 50 years. There are a number of factors that account for this. Partly the delta is sinking, so the weight of all of the construction in Bangkok and the extraction of groundwater is causing the land itself to sink. But there's also reduced sediment load coming down the rivers because the rivers have been diverted, and then sea level itself is rising. And the farmers in this area also tell us that the prevailing onshore wind has strengthened, the waves have got bigger, and this is accelerating the process of erosion over time. So the immediate impacts are the loss of coastal land, including land that houses ponds or used to house ponds, and also the destruction of homes having to be moved, and also those at the edge being flooded every time there's a high tide. So I'm going to talk about conditioners first. So a key conditioner in terms of the erosion is government support or lack thereof for the construction of protective infrastructure that could help reduce the erosion. But there are a whole range of other factors that are conditioning the viability of aquaculture in this area. So there's a lot of polluted urban runoff, a lot of eutrophic water coming downstream as well. So there are frequent red tides that can actually kill some of the marine species. There's an invasion of black-chin tilapia, which get into ponds and eat the shrimp larvae. There's less wild seed than there used to be in the past. So these are extensive systems that were dependent on natural productivity. Commodity prices, so the global price of shrimp is low. There's also a lot of salt farming in these areas. Many of the shrimp farmers are also salt farmers. The price of salt also fluctuates a lot. And we have conversion of ponds into land for urban use also occurring. So all of those things are impacting what's happening within this specific area. In terms of adaptations, the people on the seaward side where the erosion is happening have had to move their houses inland, and actually in some cases they've had to move several times as more and more land has been eroded. There's also a lot of livelihood diversification, so people moving to work off farm. In terms of changes in the aquaculture system itself, there's increasingly stocking of seed from hatcheries or imported wild seed from other places, so crablets from the south of Thailand, for instance. Farms can close off the sluices to their ponds to keep out polluted water. They can drain ponds to try and eliminate black-chin tilapia. And also we noted some farmers trying to produce organically and in order to get a premium for their product. In terms of outcomes then, actually aquaculture in this zone is one among diverse livelihood activities. So all of these households There's very few of them that are completely dependent on aquaculture. Many of them are involved in marine fishing, factory work, all kinds of other businesses. So this helps them to keep going. The erosion is clearly linked to, but certainly not caused exclusively by climate change. However, that erosion does pose an existential threat to coastal aquaculture, even in the immediate term in some cases due to this ongoing loss of land. But there are also multiple other environmental and economic and other factors that are affecting production day to day and production decisions day to day. And it's actually quite remarkable how, in some ways, how resilient this system appears to be. So it's been here for more than 100 years. It's been continuously adapted to cope with these changes, and it's still going strong apart from this advancing coastal erosion. Okay, and here, just to illustrate over time the way in which this land has been eaten up by the sea, as you can see in these three images. So to conclude very quickly, the literature lags far behind the experience of climate change as it is already occurring, and as it is already impacting aquaculture. There's far too little detailed empirical evidence of what's occurring already from far too few places. There are some general trends apparent in the types of hazards, the types of impacts, the types of adaptations that are reported in the literature that are occurring, but those are highly contingent. They're all mediated by very localized sets of environmental, social, and economic conditioners that vary widely from one place to another. So everywhere is unique, even though there are some of these broad patterns that are consistent. We have a few examples of really catastrophic production losses that are linked to climate change, such as our case study from Mexico. But even in those cases, those impacts and adaptations to them are inseparable from the wider social ecological system and everything that's occurring there. So, for instance, in the Mexico case, the governance of water in dams, in reservoirs, plays a critical role in mediating or increasing the impacts that climate change is having. Then we see at sort of current levels of global warming, so about 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial conditions, climate change seems to be mainly acting as an additional stressor or one additional factor among many that farmers must contend with, but can often be manageable given simple improvements or changes in husbandry or farm management. That's the current sort of overview. However, if we look further into the future to likely future levels, which very well may get to 3 or 4 degrees C or even more above pre-industrial levels, then we're really looking at a shift towards a fundamental existential threat to aquaculture and a great many other things. So if you imagine the kind of erosion that's occurring in Thailand, occurring on a vastly greater scale and at a vastly accelerated pace, we're looking some decades into the future. This is what we may confront. However, for the time being, it seems like the kinds of stresses and impacts that climate change is bringing about are actually relatively manageable in many cases. And I will conclude there. Thank you very much for listening.
A huge thank you, Ben. I know he worked through the small hours of the night to record this presentation for you. We're not going to take any questions for Ben now. I know he's listening online, but if you do have any questions, please drop them into the chat box or pass them to Anton or March, and then I'll make sure they get to Ben. We're going to move on to our third speaker now, and it gives me great pleasure to invite Professor Christopher Coates from the University of Galway in Ireland. And Christopher's going to be talking about drowning in disease and crumbling crustaceans. So Christopher, it's over to you.
Hopefully this works. Yeah. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the conference organizers and the sponsors for putting on a really impressive conference, hopefully the first of many. So now for something a little bit different, something that I've probably spent way too much time thinking about, probably made me ill myself, but you know, exploring crustacean health and welfare in sustainable aquaculture. And first, fish get all the attention in aquaculture, and just a brief basic reminder that you know, crustaceans are a diverse invertebrate group of around 67,000 species, mostly aquatic, but there are terrestrial and of course across freshwater, brackish and marine. They're distinguished by an external calcified segmented exoskeleton with biramous appendages. That means they bifurcate. They have multiple convergences. But it's the decapods that really make this group synonymous. There's over 14,000 species of familiar and often commercially exploited species like crabs, lobsters, crayfish, prawns, and shrimp. In terms of commercial activities, they're dominated by feed, production for humans, and food as well as a food source for things that we eat. There's emerging markets for valorization and so on, natural products, but they're eclipsed by food and feed. Where I'm from, in the Republic of Ireland, we have no cultured crustaceans. The entire decapod crustacean market is about 122 million euro. Downstream consequences are about 3,000 to 4,000 people employed in this market. And then we see, when we look at, can everybody hear me? Yep, great. When we look at the global decapod aquaculture, it has outpaced fisheries for a number of years. In fact, it's now estimated, according to the FAO, as double the tonnage in terms of what's produced and what's sold. Fisheries are static at about 6 million tons. If we look at the world's most cultured species in terms of crustaceans, Penaeus vannamei Pacific white shrimp, we can see that approximately 200 billion individuals are produced every year. And in fact, it's estimated that over 600 billion crustaceans are produced globally and consumed every year. So this is a gigantic scale. And that begs the question, well, what makes them sick? Or you can't do health without disease and vice versa. And it should come as no surprise that, in fact, many of the stressors that affect fish, that affect vertebrates, have deleterious impacts on decapod crustaceans, such as biological and biohazard threats, physical threats in terms of the environment, and also chemical, whether it's a pollutant or whether it's a toxin derived from a harmful algal bloom. But how does one define what is healthy? It's much easier to say when something has gone wrong, but how do you manage or even quantify a healthy state or a stress state in these particular animals? And that's what I've been thinking about for quite a long time. And you can be the judge whether I've been successful or not in figuring this out. So this is a figure that I produced a couple of years ago for my understanding of what happens when a crab or a prawn is stressed. So in the bottom left-hand corner, we have the stressor event, whether it's biological, chemical, or physical. And if it's acute, this is usually transient. You know, acute stress that lasts several hours to perhaps days in some species has no long-term impact on the host. We have a burst of catecholamines that regulate the system. We have some minor immune modulation and stimulation. And then we have metabolic resistance. So innate cell stress responses kick in and the organism is maintained. So allostasis, it's homeostasis through change. Then if it becomes subacute, transitioning towards chronic, this is a danger zone. So recovery likelihood is still high, but as we move across the horizontal axis, as time goes on, we have resource reallocation. That is not a problem if acquisition is in supply. So in culture systems, resource is not in short supply because you can input a food source. We then have some altered metabolic pathways to try and cope with the extra burden on the host. And then we begin to have dysregulation, including oncotic pressure. So systems are working close to or beyond their functional limit. And then we start to see changes in immune modulation, measurable changes. And if we continue on and this becomes chronic, then we have a precipitous drop in the likelihood of recovery. And I've been trying to figure out at what point is the point of no return. When is it too much? We have enhanced disease susceptibility. You see opportunists emerging. The immune system is compromised and suppressed. But more accurately, the host is metabolically deranged. It's exhausted. Even though resource is still in plentiful supply, it cannot cope. So cell damage has reached a critical level, and we start to see behavioral shifts, and by then it's way too late. Usually you see lethargic crustaceans. They become anorexic, they don't want to eat, and so on. Limbs, they autotomize automatically, and so on. And then you have physical changes, carapace discoloration, molting aberrations like dysecdysis, and so on. So why am I telling you all of this? Because we have a very basic understanding of these systems, despite decades of really valiant work by some really brilliant people. Technology is not there. You know, in terms of scale, we have a lot for vertebrates for obvious reasons and very little for invertebrates. Infectious disease outbreaks is when the balance is tipped, the scale in favor of the pathogen, the disease-causing agent. But the risk for fish, shellfish, and macroalgae is a function of the biological species itself, the host, the environment, so the ambient environmental conditions, and the disease presence in the water. So this could be known disease-causing agents, emerging and unknown. I mean, for example, if the environmental conditions deteriorate in a pond system, if you have lowered pH, this reduces the crustacean's ability to harden its exoskeleton. If you have a vast or a very rapid change in salinity, because crab blood, the hemolymph, is isosmotic with its surrounding environment, the salinity level in the water matches what's inside the host. And that's the same with the temperature because they're ectothermic. And so what you see in the pond reflects a degraded or a degrading host in terms of the physiology. And then temperature, which is often cited as the proximal driver in these things, if current IPCC predictions are true, or even if we exceed them by 2100, they can cope with 1 or 2 degrees Celsius change. Most cultured species are tropical. They can do this, even the temperate and the boreal species. There are a few exceptions. And so recently we were tasked with trying to distill this into a way for veterinarians to begin to assess or to try and diagnose disease in animals. This was spurred by recent changes in legislation in the United Kingdom that now recognize decapod crustaceans as sentient beings alongside cephalopods and vertebrates. So this has downstream consequences for fishers and for aquaculturists. So theoretically, if you had a sick lobster or crab or prawn, how would you go about assessing its health status? So first is the external, non-invasive, non-lethal, which is behavior and exoskeleton integrity. You also can monitor water parameters. And then if you need, you can do invasive but non-lethal testing. So extraction of hemolymph, and then you can measure certain parameters, but I'll get on to biochemical and cellular measures in a moment. And if a dissection or a necropsy is needed, it's now recommended that you put the animals under anesthetic. And this could be something as simple as a bath with clove oil, because eugenol is a universal anesthetic and analgesic. And worst case scenario, you need to report an invasive species carrying a disease or a notifiable disease to OA, and so on. It's overly simple, and it is trying to condense an immense amount of information, and a lot of it is flawed. So moving on, we wanted to try and make sense of the information out there. So preventative and therapeutic veterinary care is limited, practically non-existent for crustaceans. There's a lot of on-the-ground knowledge that isn't in textbooks, and they show signs of disease, not symptoms. They cannot relay symptoms of pain or suffering or illness. And there's no consensus amongst crustacean practitioners or fish handlers about operational welfare indicators or common biomarkers of health and stress. There are no standards. There are suggestions, but there are no standards. And how people measure these vary greatly. So what I tasked a PhD student at the University of Galway with, Eliane Keneally, is trying to make sense of this information, and she probably hates me for it. But to go through systematically the available literature and to pick out pieces to try and add some statistical rigor and physiological mechanisms behind quite a lot of the condition, vigor and mortality indices that people have been using on vessels and pondside for many years. So that we use a PRISM approach for meta-analysis to follow best practice guidelines, including key search terms, etc. This paper is published. If anybody's interested, I can send it to you. But this is the key bit here. So using all the available search engines, tools, going through all of the papers that we selected, then going through all of the papers that cite them, as well as their listed sources of references. And we had key exclusion and inclusion criteria. We were focused on the hemolymph because it's the only, aside from claw muscle, it is the only other tissue that you can sample that is non-lethal in terms of being invasive. Exposure duration, stressor not named, no baseline level data recorded, stress not physical, and standard deviation not recorded. The number of papers that don't have negative controls is staggering, and it automatically excludes them from a meta-analysis. Those studies that don't report standard deviation or standard variation are automatically excluded as well. So we only want studies that have very transparent data reported. So this, after reviewing several thousand papers, sometimes twice, to remove duplicates, etc., we arrived on 59 studies. And in this first meta-analysis, we focused solely on non-infectious stressors, so non-communicable, so any sort of disease-causing agent we eliminated, just for the first round. So from these 59 studies, we extracted 459 effect sizes covering 29 decapod crustacean species, 8 hematological indicators, and 12 physical stressors, which vary from trawling to immersion to handling to transport to electromagnetic field exposure to noise, seismic ergon, and so on. Whatever had robust data, we tried to include. We then built a series of generalized mixed linear models, and we threw everything in the lab sink at these models. And we had over 100 iterations of these models to try and account for the biological sex of crabs, their age, i.e. their size, their molt status, if that information was available, the temperature, the pH, the salinity, and so on, in various iterations. And invariably, L-lactate came out as a key indicator of stress. In every single version of this model, we asked, what is the effect size associated with? And L-lactate was there. So L-lactate increases in its presence in the hemolymph. So what happens is it is not an immune marker, and it is not a stress hormone. There are no stress hormones in crabs. They have a hormone that dictates glucose metabolism. It's called crustacean hyperglycemic hormone, but it's not a stress hormone. That elevates in the hemolymph when they're under duress. This leads to the breakdown of glycogen into glucose, and then the glucose is transferred into the muscle as it's transitioning from aerobic to anaerobic metabolic processes. So it's consuming the oxygen to fuel the response. And L-lactate is the downstream byproduct of this. So it accumulates in such vast quantities in the muscle, it starts to spill over in the hemolymph, and that's when we can measure it. And on the other end, we have total hemocyte counts. Hemocytes are the functional equivalent to immune cells in crabs, and they are depleted in these animals. So simultaneously, you have an increase in a metabolic byproduct, and you have a degeneration in the number of circulating immune cells in the host. So they become vulnerable to infection. Now, these figures, this is a funnel plot, this is a forest plot, and what do they tell us? They ask us about the how biased were we in our selection and in our exclusion and inclusion criteria. And we can see in this funnel plot that the data is largely symmetrical. It represents an inverted funnel, which is associated with ecological data sets that usually bias against papers with overly large dispersion. We performed Egger's regression test for asymmetry and a tau rank test, and neither of those statistical tests suggested that we had any gross publication bias in our data set. So our approach was robust. And in terms of the forest plot, this looks at the effect size of the data and spread, and we can see a largely positive response between the stressor and what we are measuring, and they're largely uniform. So that's good. So after running more and more of these models, we determined that L-lactate increases, on average, several-fold in the hemolymph between days 1 and 14 post-stress in all of the decapod crustaceans that we measured. And metabolic byproducts in the hemolymph, like urea, ammonia, and glucose not so much, increase between 2 and 4-fold in concentration. So in fact, from our data set, and the data is available online, if anybody wants to do a better job than we did, suggests that metabolic byproducts are the best indicator. And in fact, there are commercially available handheld refractometers that are not inexpensive, but cheaper than molecular-based approaches to measure hemolymph pondside or on ships. So this is a good thing. Okay. So I'll pivot aggressively now, and I'll jump into a biological stress, which is a disease-causing agent. So these are hematidinium, these halo surrounding morphotypes in the hemolymph. They're microparasites of decapod crustaceans. They're globally dispersed. They're found as far north as Greenland, as far south as New Zealand. Okay? They impact about over 50 species of crustaceans globally, and they cause several disease-related conditions: post-molt syndrome, bitter crab syndrome, sometimes referred to as milky crab disease. Okay, they can impact the taste of the meat, and they lead to wastes in fisheries, and now emerging in polyculture systems. The last 20 years, there's been an increase in detection and in the diversity of species that are impacted by hematidinium, most notably in Shandong in China, polyculture systems. So why do we care about this? Well, it impacts all of these highly important decapod crustaceans. Blue crab Calonectes in the US, about $5 million annually in losses. Velvet swimming crab, that fishery collapsed in France about 30 years ago because of an outbreak of this disease. And this is endemic in the waters around the UK and Ireland. And it's now considered the most important temperate microparasite of crustaceans across Europe. But most recently, it's emerging in polyculture systems. It has been detected in monodon, but this is, it's not a big issue right now. Mud crabs, mudflat crabs, and the Asian blue crab, portunids. So this is an emerging problem. It can lead to financial loss. In extreme circumstances, it can make the animal compromised. It can impact taste and quality post-mortem. So even if the animal looks alive and looks okay, the consumers may reject it. And we have no intervention. We have no therapeutics to treat this disease. We have no pond-side diagnostics, reliable ones, to diagnose this disease. So it's old-fashioned hemolymph extraction and dissection and so on. In terms of climate change, there are some species, so Calonectes in the US and its Hematodinium peretzi, that's probably the most close host pathogen interaction we have in terms of the Asian blue crab, and it's the same species of dinoflagellate that impacts it. Now here in the grey box, this is the aerobic scope, or the tolerance of the blue crab to temperature change and oxygen change. And the continuous line is the crab thermal range, and then here this discontinuous line is the hematodinium. And what we can see is that actually a couple of degrees Celsius pushed higher is that hematodinium is okay. In fact, it likes this, whereas the crab is starting to reach its limit or just go beyond. Between 2003 and 2005 in Newfoundland in Canada, there was a massive outbreak of Hematodinium peretzi in Cyanoecetes, so in the snow crabs. And this was attributed to a 1% increase in water temperatures, so a 5-fold increase in parasite prevalence. So we have species, like boreal species, that they have very strict thermal ranges. And then species like this, and by extension, the Asian crabs, that have a little bit of flexibility. But in fact, fundamental biology on these hosts, what are temperature extremes in terms of these parasites and so on, there's very little information out there. So we followed another program to try and see if there were any universal markers of this disease in the hemolymph of crabs to give some sort of confidence to people diagnosing disease or inspecting for disease. We used the gross same approach, and we found only 15 studies. There's an immense amount of literature on the pathology of this disease in terms of histopathology, what the crabs look like, but very little on biomarkers, on immunity. And so this was very frustrating. So from 15 studies, we extracted 184 effect sizes covering 7 decapod crustacean species, 18 hematological measures. We threw those into our models, and we just recapitulated. We add heuristic data and statistical rigor to what was already known but never really tested, in that when salinity goes over 30 PSU, you get gross outbreaks of this disease. And the most obvious indicators in the host are they have a depletion of protein, so they have hyperproteinemia, and total hemocyte counts, which is hemocytopenia. But by that time, it's too late. These animals will die. Death is now inevitable. So we've no early warning indicators that are easy to measure for this particular disease that we know of. And immune markers like phenyl oxidase, which is a universal marker in most invertebrates, it's a fundamental immune response. There's no difference between those that have this disease and those that don't, which is really frustrating. So higher infection load, more pronounced clinical signs, that's pretty obvious. As the disease progresses, the hosts become weaker. Larger and older animals are statistically the least likely to be infected. So these crustaceans tend to live fast and die young. They'll get this disease at an early stage and it will progress. If they manage to make it into adulthood, they are less likely to carry this disease or to actually transfer this disease. And yesterday we spoke a little bit about, in our session, the need for natural systems and measurements of natural populations and how they work in terms of the microbiome. But when we reiterated our models in different aspects, we demonstrated that host-derived responses are more obvious, so the effect sizes are much larger when you're observing measures from wild-caught animals versus those infected under lab conditions, even when you control for the disease burden. Even when you give the same dose to the animal in the lab that you find in the field, you get much more pronounced host responses in terms of their measurements from wild-caught animals. So this is I'm providing evidence against my own career choice in terms of less lab manipulation and more field work is needed for this. And finally, before I'm drop-kicked off stage, Hematodinium decapod seasonal cues. This was a recent paper led by my good friend Amaya Albalat in Stirling, and we reanalyzed approximately 30 years of discontinuous data of nephrops infection, cancer pagoris infection, and shore crab infection data from Great Britain and Ireland, and we demonstrated synchronicity in terms of the peak infection levels and the nadir in terms of when disease is at its lowest, or the incident level is at its lowest. And the question we tried to answer, but the data wasn't good enough to answer in terms of the historical data, is has there been a switch, a driver in change impacting when disease prevalence occurs? Anecdotally, yes, but we didn't have enough to analyze it robustly. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for listening.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Do we have one quick question for Francis? Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks. Fascinating presentation, Chris. What do your results say, just coming back to the earlier presentations about preventative strategies? I mean, you've got indicators of stresses there, but can you say something about, the lack of, there's some evidence of adaptive innate immunity, heat shock, protein, vaccines, etc., linkages with what you've been talking about with potential management strategies, preventative?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't have a very focused answer for it. The first thing, it's biosecurity. Prevention is better than cure. What's difficult about this pathogen is that it can transfer directly between hosts and across species. It doesn't need, like most marine diseases, it doesn't need a marine vector. In terms of immunity or immune priming, it doesn't matter in these animals, because one conspicuous aspect of this particular group of pathogens is that they completely evade host immune responses. So even when an organism is infected with hematodinium and something else, the host responds to something else, but not to hematodinium. Even when the host has damaged itself and is repairing, hematodinium don't even get caught up in the reactions accidentally. So yeah, there's a fundamental lack of information. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Christopher. Thank you very much. A big hand again. Thank you. We're now going to move on to our fourth speaker, and it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Pramoda Kumar Sahoo from CIFA in India. And Dr. Sahoo is going to be talking about freshwater aquaculture and fish diseases in a climate change scenario. So, Dr. Sahoo, the microphone is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Andrew. First of all, let me thank again Professor Andrew, Jerul, Partho, and the whole team, AquaSustain team, for giving me this opportunity to come over and share our experience. So good afternoon, everybody, and friends, those who have joined virtually, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon all to all of you. In fact, I am here in between two excellent presentations made by Dr. Rohana, Dr. Ben, and in between lunch. The advantage is my friends sitting here on the front, they will not show me because we can prolong, I can take some advantages of time. The disadvantage is many of my slides may be of some kind of repetition, what has been told. Nevertheless, we have been hearing to Professor Rohana and Dr. Ben whether climate change is evident, occurring or not. There are several examples you have listened. To me, it is the fish farmer. At the end of the day, we have to reply them. So, I will directly go to the topic. I will not cover many of these things which have been told. As you all know, this fish is a poikilothermic animal, and even slightest change in water temperature, which is part of the global warming or a climate change, definitely it is going to affect the fish. And it has been summarized or well felt that the temperate fishes are much more prone to climate change rather than the tropical species. But it is also a big question. But nevertheless, as has been told by Christopher or Ben, the stress is a major challenge in aquaculture system, and always this climate change or climatic events are bringing more stress to fish, and always it is superimposed with multiple stressful conditions. There are some publications which is mentioning the positive impact of climate change, and simultaneously we have several negative impact also. So always the negative impact of climate change is overweighing the positive impact. We have listened into the adaptations, number of examples which have been cited by different countries to the climate change events from Dr. Ben, citing couple of examples. But nevertheless, these adaptation mechanisms are short-term rather than long-term measures which have been told as mitigation measures. So I will not repeat because it has been mentioned some of the direct effects like monsoon patterns or the occurrence of extreme climatic conditions or water stress or saline water intrusions or temperature fluctuations, all those direct impact, and coming to the indirect impacts, the disease situations or the biodiversity or the resources, availability of the resources, which are being very well summarized in one of this diagram, which I have taken. You can see the climate change in different forms, whether it is cyclone, whether it is drought or global warming or flood or rainfall, which has been already mentioned, which are affecting the ultimately the environment, the resources, the habitat, the eutrophication systems, the biotic depletion, or the ecological effect, whether it is disease, or it is greenhouse gas emission, or we are so-called, it is, we are talking now about the carbon neutral aquaculture, all those things. So ultimately it is affecting the complete life cycle of the fish, complete value chain of the production system. So whether it is spawn, fry, or fingerling or the adult, in every stage it is affected, whether it is growth, whether it is feeding, whether it is physiology, whether it is occurring in terms of mortality. So why it is so important for aquaculture? As you all know, it is now growing so fast. The production, it has been predicted it will reach from the production from aquaculture, it will reach more than 53% by 2030. And in a country like India, where we are getting more than 60 to 70% we are getting from the aquaculture. So that's why it is so important. And one of the example, as Professor Rohana mentioned, that 245 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent is coming which is very negligible. It is around 0.5% of total greenhouse gas emission from the fisheries segment. But if you see the one of the example I got, the emission is only roughly 7% from the aquaculture in terms of carbon dioxide entity. But at the end of the day, the small scale farmers, they are much more affected, because this is ultimately what Professor Rohana told. It is affecting the whole value chain, whether it is in terms of resources, in terms of production. Ultimately, it is being the small scale farmers, they are being affected with the system. And it is affecting not only the environment, it is affecting the economic as well as social sustainability also. So we have several examples of the global warming, whether it is extreme climatic events, whether it is rainfall. I am not going into all those details because it will be more of a repetition. But some of the projective effect, it has been felt like which has not been mentioned. So for example, temperature rise, just some of the examples. So there is a extended growing season for warm water species. I will just cite one example of scampi or freshwater prawn. Normally, they won't grow comfortably beyond 23-degree temperature. So if the temperature period is long, so the farmers can grow for a 7 months or 8 months culture, they can do comfortably. And extreme climatic events, which is adding or mixing to the water column, rainfall, mostly it increases the scope of more areas under culture, and promote also the wastewater management, like disease or harmful algal blooms, and which is helpful for particularly eliminating the cold water pathogens. The sea level rise, there is increased areas of brackish water farming, external input supply uncertainty. So it puts tremendous pressure on the system to look for the alternative feed resources, alternative protein sources. And ozone acidification, it has also some positive way. It has been taken that increased seed production of new species. We are looking for the new species where we can address all those things. There are several mitigation and adaptive strategies which have been mentioned in literature. I am not going into all those details. But what I would like to emphasize upon here, there are a couple of adaptation strategies as a research institute that we are looking into, we are addressing. For example, species diversification. Now China is working on more than 800 species in aquaculture. Perhaps India, we are working with 90 species. Coming to freshwater aquaculture, we have only 2.5 dozen of species where we are working. Why it is so important? We have more than thousands of food species, and it is highly important to develop technology package of practices for those species. Perhaps some of these species will be playing very important or crucial role in the advent of climate change. That is very, very important. One more thing, China, for example, they have more than 240 improved varieties, improved species they are working through selection. It is not a small joke. That's why perhaps that is one of the factors. Although their production is much more from the glass carp or black carp or whatever it may be, tilapia, some of the species are taking the market, major share. But they have more than 240 species of improved varieties where they are playing. Perhaps these improved varieties, it has several advantages to address the future challenges. Challenges in terms of production, not only in terms of production, but also when your temperature is rising, when your water area in a particular location, a particular pond is remaining for 6 months instead of perennial system, Perhaps the farmers have left with improved varieties which will give higher income or same production or same table size fish production within a shortest time. I will give some example later on. Coming to the breed and seed production, what is being noticed? There is a shift in season. The issues are shift in season, breeding season. I mean to say, narrow breeding window, poor breeding performance, poor survival and long rearing period. So what we are doing in terms of carps, we are using different technologies with regards to photothermal manipulation, so that even there is extreme winter for a longer period or extreme temperature, we are manipulating the temperature and we are widening the breeding season through photothermal manipulation. Again, when we have several constraints with regards to rainfall or with regards to water scarcity, so you have very different systems for high density seed rearing system. Seed forms one of the major junk for the aquaculture system. So you can use either concrete or bioflux systems, even year-round stunting systems which is going on for zero-size stocking. If zero-size stocking in Indian carp farming system, I think many of you might be knowing. So they grow the fish over a period of 8 to 9 months in high stocking density to make zero-size stocking or stunted fingerlings, which will be stocked around 100 to 200 gram size, and they will be reaching to table size within 5 to 6 months in aquaculture system in the ponds. And winter growth retardation, which we have felt a longer winter. Perhaps this we can take it as a boon for seed stunting program. And creation of additional seed rearing area, perhaps as Dr. Das was mentioning, like pen culture we can take up. And we have to create a awareness about the quality seeds. And coming to the grow out to production systems, issues are underutilization of pond productivity or high capital investment. We are promoting cropping pattern, change in cropping pattern, how a single stocking, multiple harvesting, or intercropping with small indigenous species or minor carps along with major carps, or prawn with major carps, how it will be advantageous. For all these systems, we have seen how much benefit a farmer will get. And that will address perhaps whether it is a temperature, whether it is a water scarcity, all those things can be addressed, and the farmers are really adapting to the system. And coming to grow out to diversification systems, we are also trying to utilize, there was a question about multi-trophic aquaculture and promoting natural farming or integrated farming, even rain. So it is very advantageous to manage the wastewater aquaculture systems. We have now very concrete technologies so far as bioflux system is concerned, so far as RAS system is concerned, particularly for seed rearing. What we have seen, more than 27 times seed can be produced in the same unit area without exchange of water for carps and some of the medium carp species also. Coming to RAS, which we are using for high value species, particularly catfish species, more than 40 kg per cubic meter you can generate, particularly for raising the stockable size in the pond systems. So all these technologies, they have their own advantages. And again, input supply will be a big challenge in advent of climate change. So we have to look for alternative feed resources. So we are emphasizing on farm-made feed, how to develop low-cost feed, looking into the availability of the feed ingredients. Like insect larvae, we have developed couple of feed formulas, how to replace even 75% of fish meal using insect larvae in carnivorous diet, up to 50% using in 50% replacement of fish meal in carp diets. And disease is really a big challenge in the advent of climate change. India has a very strong surveillance system, surveillance network. We have developed 2 different apps like Report a Fish Disease or Treat My Fish app, which are being very routinely used, more than lakhs of downloads by the farmers to reach out to the scientists, to the researchers immediately to diagnose their problems. Although we have not made a major dent with regards to fish vaccine is concerned, because most of the fish species what we are culturing are low value species. But recently we have commercialized couple of vaccines which can be utilized. Just I will give some example what I was mentioning about my institute, what we are doing. The farmers are facing the major problem is the breeding season. They are losing, they are getting hardly a month. Carp is mostly in a seasonal breeder. They are getting hardly a month. Slowly the breeding window, breeding season is reducing. So we have taken up a genetic improvement program how to increase the breeding window. Almost we have got very good clue to expand the breeding window from 2 to 3 months to up to 8 months. We are still working on this aspect. Besides, when we are adding both breeding window as well as photothermal manipulation, so probably the farmers at the end of the day may get year-round seed for stocking into their ponds. What I was mentioning about the biofloc system, you can just one example economics I have given. The seed production, the BC ratio is 5.83. Survivability is more than 90% when you will compare with the pond system. So pond system, never we used to get more than 30% survivability. And again, alternative feed resources I was mentioning. And also, we are working on one organization working on 3 improved varieties of species through classical selective breeding approach. That is for Rohu, we have reached 15th generation with more than 60% higher growth in field conditions. Katla, another important Indian major carp species, we are in 3rd generation but getting more than 30% higher growth. Scampi, freshwater prawn, Macrobacum rosenbergi, which we have initiated through World Fish. We are in 15th generation, more than 50 to 60% higher growth. So probably these 3 species, which are the major producers of carps and prawn in freshwater system, they will address the future in the climate change scenario. And yesterday there was a discussion how to reach out. I think Jerul was asking. We have established aquaculture field schools. Aquaculture field schools, it is a farmer-to-farmer extension approach. The progressive farmers are being provided with all sorts of technologies, and they will be the region for demonstrating all these technologies to the nearby farmers. So that is one of the beautiful approach for farmers-to-farmer extension approach. Now we have also developed different systems, gadgets, which will be discussed in the afternoon. I will not go into these feeders and all those sensory-based systems where farmers can control their feeding in the pond systems. Nevertheless, my second part is disease. Yes, disease is definitely a great challenge, it is a great concern, because it is influencing whether it is a bacteria, whether it is parasite, or whether it is a fungus. The temperature plays a very, very crucial role, if you all know. For example, I will cite US. US, mostly it happens at a temperature between 20 to 30 degrees centigrade. Mostly we have seen after rainfall. But as Professor Rohana was mentioning, whether climate change is there or not, we were getting earlier, just after rain or after rainy season, we were getting US. Now most of throughout the year we are getting those cases. But it is mostly seen in cooler months or after rainfall, like KHB. It is very temperature sensitive pathogen. Those who have worked, they will realize how it is being played between 15 to 25 degrees centigrade. Like that, several examples are there. I am not going into all those details. Nevertheless, suppose you can take up the example of parasites. I will simply say one particular parasite like sea lice. Andrew is working for a long time on sea lice, and we are working on freshwater fish lice. The lice lay eggs. If temperature is below 15 degree, 16 degree in case of freshwater lice, the eggs will be remaining idle for more than a year or so. If temperature is increasing beyond 26 degree, 28 degree, within 15 days, 18 days, the hatching will happen. And if the temperature will be prolonged for a longer time, multiple hatching will occur, multiple times they will lay eggs. So you can get year-round infections, year-round problems. So there are a lot of things which we need to look into in the advent of temperature. One issue that I am mentioning. I had several examples I cannot cite, but we are very closely looking into, for example, one particular farm. Now the case, as yesterday Dr. Mohan was mentioning, we have to give more emphasis on syndromic surveillance. Now disease is never happening because of a single etiological agent. Every year the cases are changing. In a single system, when there is infection is there, you will get multiple infections. Along with bacteria parasites, these co-infections are now taking up much more in cases of viral diseases. We are getting, for example, like your tilapines. In tilapines, TILB was there, TIPV was occurring singly. Now, in combination, it is occurring along with also bacterial pathogens and many other things. Just I will cite one example of temperate tropical aquaculture. It has virus replication may be negatively influenced. Bacterial multiplication may increase if there is temperature rise. So there are several aspects with regards to the pathogenicity. Just one example I will cite with the common bacteria, Aeromonas hydrophila, which we have looked into very closely. If temperature is below 26 degrees centigrade, the pathogenicity is drastically down. Why it is drastically down? We have looked into several at the molecular level also. Many of these toxic genes are expressed less than 10-fold. Even slight 2-degree deviation in temperature makes a pathogen very pathogenic or moderately pathogenic or less pathogenic. Even it is affecting ultimately the human population, the occurrence of zoonosis or vibrios, or whether there will be much more emergence of drug resistance pathogen, future will tell. So definitely what I would like to conclude here, climate change is inevitable. Mitigation measures, definitely it is much more effective than adaptive measures. But certainly, I think Mike will definitely speak about the natural aquaculture, how it will address after lunch. These aquaculture technologies, perhaps they serve as a potential to address the climate change to sustain the production from economic as well as also social point of view. Thank you very much. So this is my institute, and this is our farm, which is spread over 147 hectares, more than 350 experimental ponds, which is working dedicatedly on freshwater aquaculture in eastern part of India. Thank you very much once again for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sahoo. I'm going to hold the questions because you raised a very important point there about perhaps the need for new species. So we actually have a surprise presentation now. We actually have a fifth speaker. When I look around the room, I see lots of young faces, but we have one particularly young face. And what I'd like to do is I would like to call upon Joseph Murrey, who's from Scotland, and he's going to be talking about, do we need new species for sustainable intensification, which follows the very important point that you made.
Thank you.
So may I thank you, but may I call upon Joe to give a short talk on his subject. Would you like to stand up?
Okay, can I leave? Yeah. So I'll leave.
I will share the slide for you. Just a moment.
Thank you.
Ah,
Yeah,
okay.
thank you.
One moment. Okay.
Do we need new species for sustainable intensification? Pescanova is a very controversial octopus form. They closed the life cycle of Octopus vulgaris in 2019. In 2021, they applied for a permit in Gran Canaria, and they proposed to produce 3,000 tons of octopus per year. They have invested $65 million into this project and will have to kill 1 million animals per year to reach the octopuses will reach 3 kilograms after 1.5 years. They will put 10 to 15 animals per square meter. They expect 10 to 15% mortality rate, and they will have their first harvest in 2027, and they will harvest between 300 to 500 tons per year, but there's a lot of resistance. Why should we farm octopuses? There is high demand, particularly in Spain, Asia, and South America. They have high value delicacy in tapas, poke, and sushi. Octopuses have fast growth and high yield, and they're quite healthy to eat. It might reduce fishing pressure. An example of this is in 1950 to 2015, wild catch has increased by 10 times to 400,000 tons. The case against welfare concerns. Octopuses are sentient, and they're probably the closest thing we'll ever come to meeting an intelligent alien. In My Octopus the Teacher, he portrays them as curious, intelligent, and affectionate. Do they require mentally stimulating environment? Not sure yet. Is harvesting using an ice? They've proposed to harvest the octopuses using an ice bath by freezing them to death, and scientists have found out that they still have brain activity when they're frozen. Overcrowding can cause to aggression, cannibalism, and escapes. Octopuses have a pure food conversion ratio. Animal welfare laws don't apply to invertebrates. Pescanova responds by saying they claim loss of aggression after 5 breeding generations, and if coat traditions are ideal, they'll give the right feed, the right temperature, and the right oxygen levels, and pH light, and light. And they say there's no need for environmental simulation, but data lacking for reduced aggression at farm scale. Not other criticisms, not just octopus. Per food conversion ratio, does it meet a food security need or a want? It is also part of a wider criticism of industrial farming. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joe. Some valuable lessons there, and I'm sure you have questions, but perhaps we can take those into the lunchtime. So thank you again, Dr. Sahoo, for raising a very important question there about the need for new species. We're going to close this session now, but just before I do, I just want to say that do you work in Thailand? Are you working or researching here in Thailand? Then if so, then we have this wonderful opportunity to capture your views on fish vaccination. If you do, please come and say hello to Dr. Senapin. And not only do you have a wish to complete this questionnaire, but if you do so, there's also a souvenir. So it's a very good reason for taking this souvenir. I'm now going to pass over to Alex, and Alex is going to close the session. So thank you.
with this, we wrap up this session. Thank you so much to all the keynote speakers for such valuable insights, especially Joe. Great job. And we go for lunch. Just an announcement, we come back at 12:55 because we will start with the next session at 1 sharp. Okay, thank you so much.